Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today, you and I are heading way, way back in time to explore a really fascinating dinosaur, Afrovenator.
African hunter.
Yeah,
Just the name itself is evocative, isn't it?
it really is. It tells you we're looking at a significant predator. We've got a stack of, well, paleontological findings, research papers,
Yeah.
basically the evidence trail left behind.
Exactly. And our mission today, if you will, is to sort of piece together that evidence. We want to understand Afrovenator, figure out its spot in the whole dinosaur family tree, and, really get what makes it special.
Okay, think of it as our own little expedition into the Jurassic guided by the fossils. So the story kicks off with its discovery, right? Back in 93.
That's right, 1993. The key find was in the Theropods Formation, which is in Niger, northern Africa.
And that was a big deal, finding it there.
Oh, absolutely. Finding a relatively complete skeleton of a large theropod, a meat eater,
Yeah.
in that part of the world. Well, it's pretty significant. Fossils aren't always that well preserved or that complete, especially from Gondwana back then.
Gondwana, the old southern supercontinent.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So this gave us a much clearer window into one of the major predators roaming around there.
And the name Afrovenator abacensis, you already mentioned, African hunter. What about the second part?
Abacensis, that's a nod to the specific place, the Abaka region within Niger, where those first bones were actually unearthed.
Ah, okay. So African hunter from Abaka, nice and specific.
Pretty much. And the discovery was formally announced pretty quickly, actually, in 1994. Paul Sereno and his team published it in Science.
Science, okay. Big journal. Now, I remember reading there was a bit of confusion early on about how old it actually was, something about the rock formation.
Yes, that's a really crucial point. And when it was first described, everyone thought the Tiran Formation was early Cretaceous,
Hmm.
so younger than it turned out to be.
And it wasn't?
No. Later geological work, looking closer at the rocks themselves, showed it's actually much older. It dates back to the middle, maybe even late Jurassic.
Oh, wow. How much older are we talking?
We're talking roughly 167 to 161 million years ago. Bathonian to Oxfordian stages, for anyone keeping score.
Okay, so middle to late Jurassic. That's a big shift from early Cretaceous. Why does that matter so much?
Well, it fundamentally changes where Afrovenator sits in the story of theropod evolution. Placing it back in the Jurassic makes it potentially a much earlier player in the game of large predatory dinosaurs.
Right. Not just some later derivative, but maybe closer to the root of some of those big predator groups.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Puts it in a different context entirely. Really shows how science works,
Yeah.
New data comes in, you have to adjust the picture.
Definitely. So we have that first skeleton, the holotype. But that wasn't the end of the story, right? Have other bits and pieces turned up since?
Oh, for sure. Science keeps digging, literally. They found isolated teeth in an even older formation underneath, the Fearsome Formation.
Older. So maybe Afrovenator relatives were around even earlier?
It suggests the possibility, yes, or at least very similar animals. Plus, a piece of an upper jaw, a maxilla, turned up in the Turon Run Formation at a different site.
Okay.
And maybe the most exciting recent development is finding new specimens, semi-articulated ones, for a place called Tawachi.
Semi-articulated, meaning the bones are still kind of connected?
Yeah, some of them are still in roughly their life positions.
Mm.
And these new finds include bones that were missing from the original skeleton. So they promise to give us an even more complete picture.
That's fantastic. Okay, let's get to the good stuff, picturing this thing. How big was the African hunter? I see different numbers thrown around.
Yeah, estimating size from fossils, especially incomplete ones, always involves some interpretation. You get a range. Gregory S. Paul, a well-known paleoartist and researcher, estimated around 8 meters long, maybe weighing a ton.
8 meters, 1 ton. Okay, that's substantial, like a big SUV.
Pretty much. Thomas Holtz Jr., another expert, suggested maybe slightly smaller, 7.6 meters, and gave a wider weight range, like 450 to 900 kilograms.
So somewhere between a large car and a small truck, maybe?
Something like that. And then a more recent estimate from 2016 put closer to 6.8 meters and around 790 kilos.
Okay, so the estimates vary a bit, but the takeaway is definitely a large predator. Probably one of the top dogs in its neighborhood.
Absolutely. A significant carnivore for its time and place.
The sources also mention it had a gracile build. What does that mean? Like skinny. And it had long arms and lower legs.
Gracile, yeah, it suggests maybe a lighter, more slender frame compared to some really bulky theropods, like, say, a T-Rex or even some other megalosaurs. Not skinny necessarily, but less massive,
More athletic, maybe?
perhaps. And yes, the relatively long forelimbs are interesting, though we only have parts. But the lower leg bones, the tibia and the metatarsals on the foot, are quite long compared to the femur, the thigh bone.
And what does that suggest?
Speed.
It often correlates with better running ability, yes. Maybe not a cheetah, but potentially faster or more agile than some other big predators. It could point towards a hunting style that involved pursuit, or at least agility. Interesting. Now, every dinosaur has its unique little quirks, right? Features that only it has. What were Afrovenator's calling cards? It's autapomorphies.
Right, those unique identifiers. Well,
Yeah.
there are a few. On the skull, in that depression in front of the eye socket, the front end of it had this weird lobed shape.
A lobe depression on
Yeah,
the cat.
and on the neck, the third neck vertebra had a low, flat, kind of rectangular spine sticking up. Very distinctive.
Huh. Not just a pointy spine?
Yep. Low and rectangular.
Mm.
Also, one of its wrist bones was super flat and crescent-shaped.
Flat wrist bone. Got it.
And in the hand, the first metacarpal, that's the hand bone leading to the thumb, had a really broad surface where it touched the second metacarpal.
Broad connection. Okay.
And finally, down to the pelvis, the bottom part of the pubic bone had a distinct notch on its back edge.
Wow. Okay, those sound like tiny details, but I guess that's how you tell these species apart, right? Those little anatomical fingerprints.
Exactly. They're crucial for diagnosis.
So let's zoom in on the skull. We don't have the whole thing, but the pieces we do have, what do they tell us? You mentioned the lobe depression. Anything else?
Well, overall, the skull seems to have been quite flat, low-profiled, not super tall. The upper jawbone, the maxilla, was long at the front. We know it had sockets for 14 teeth, though the teeth themselves were lost in the original fossil.
14 teeth on each side of the upper jaw.
Seems like it, yeah. And there were some interesting holes, or fenestrae. There's a small maxillary fenestra behind another one called a promaxillary fenestra, and this smaller hole didn't really open into that bigger depression in front of the eye.
Skull plumbing, basically.
Huh, sort of. Makes the skull lighter, probably.
Yeah.
The lacrimal bone, that's the one just in front of and above the eye socket, had a noticeable rounded horn sticking up.
A horn? Like Allosaurus? Or different?
A bit different, more rounded perhaps. And the bone behind the eye, the postorbital, its lower branch, was quite wide. The cheekbone, the jugal, was short but deep, and it looked like it was pneumatized.
Pneumatized. Air spaces inside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Again, probably to save weight without sacrificing too much strength.
Makes sense for a big predator needing to move its head around quickly. What about the teeth themselves? You said the originals were lost, but we know something about them.
Yeah, from those other referred teeth that have been found, they had these tiny serrations, denticles on the back edge that were sort of squarish or subrectangular towards the middle.
Okay.
And interestingly, the teeth had a slight S shape when you looked at them from the front or back, a sigmoidal curve.
S-shaped teeth. Is that common?
Not universally, no. But it's a feature it actually shares with another big Jurassic predator, Torvosaurus.
Torvosaurus. Found in North America and Europe, right?
Yeah.
So a shared feature across continents. That's interesting.
It is. Hints at some possible connection or similar feeding adaptations,
But
maybe.
the neck, you mentioned a weird spine on one vertebra, but overall, flexible, strong.
The neck seems to have had that classic S-curve we see in many theropods, which suggests good flexibility. You need that for striking at prey, maneuvering the head during feeding.
Yeah.
And the structure suggests it likely had pretty powerful neck muscles.
Yeah.
Good side-to-side and up-and-down movement. Some researchers think its feeding mechanics, maybe the bite or the neck strength involved, might have been more powerful than, say, Allosaurus.
More powerful than Allosaurus, wow. But maybe not as specialized as others.
Probably not as specialized as something like Spinosaurus, which had that incredibly adapted neck and skull for catching fish. Afrovenator was likely more of a generalist predator of land animals.
Okay. And you mentioned the newer fossils gave us a better look at the snout.
Yes, the premaxillae, the very front bones of the upper jaw, they show the process going up towards the nose wasn't quite as steep as they first thought. It means the nostril opening was probably a bit larger.
Little tweaks to the reconstruction. And finally, the feet. You said the leg bones hinted at running. Did the foot structure confirm that? Was it built for speed?
Well, that newer, nearly complete foot gives us a better idea. It does seem to have adaptations that would make it a better runner than Allosaurus.
Better than Allosaurus. Okay.
But it wasn't as specialized for high-speed running as, say, the Abelisaurids, another group of southern hemisphere theropods.
So maybe a capable runner, good for chasing things down, but not like a A dedicated sprinter.
That seems like a reasonable interpretation. Fast enough for its likely prey, perhaps, but maybe not built for extreme, sustained speed like some other dinosaur lineages.
Okay, this paints a pretty vivid picture. A large, somewhat slender, reasonably fast predator with a low skull, a horn, S-shaped teeth, prowling around Jurassic Africa.
That's the image emerging, yeah.
So let's shift gears a bit. Where does this African hunter fit in the grand scheme of things? The dinosaur family tree. Classification seems complicated for this one.
That's putting it mildly. It's been a bit of a journey. Nowadays, it's mostly placed within the Megalosauridae family.
Megalosauridae, okay. And what is that family exactly?
Well, historically, Megalosauridae was kind of a wastebasket. Paleontologists used to lump lots of big early theropods in there if they weren't sure where else they belonged.
Ah, the junk drawer of dinosaur classification.
Kind of, yeah. But it's much better defined now. It's considered a distinct group and generally seen as the sister group, the closest relatives to the Spinosauridae.
Spinosaurids, like Spinosaurus and Baryonyx.
Exactly. And both Megalosauridae and Spinosauridae together form a larger group called Megalosauridea.
Okay, so Afrovenator is currently thought to be a megalosaurid, part of the larger Megalosauridea group, which is related to Spinosaurids.
That's the general consensus now, yes. But getting there wasn't straightforward, and there's still debate about the specifics within Megalosauridae.
Right, because different studies seem to place it slightly differently.
Precisely. There was an analysis back in 2002 that put Afrovenator as a fairly basal member of the family, meaning it branched off relatively early.
Okay, an early megalosaurid.
But that study didn't include some other dinosaurs, like Dubroisaurus from Europe, which later studies often group with Afrovenator.
Ah, so missing relatives might skew the results.
It can happen. More recent studies often cluster Afrovenator with Dubroisaurus and another European one, Eustreptospondylis. Sometimes this cluster is called Megalosaurina, sometimes Eustreptospondyline. The subfamily names get shuffled around.
So they're definitely related, but the exact structure of their little family branch is debated.
Exactly. And one study in 2012 even suggested Afrovenator was distinct enough to deserve its own subfamily, Afrovenatorina.
Its own little branch within the megalosaurids. Okay. Why all the different results? Just new fossils or different ways of analyzing?
Both, really. New discoveries add more data points. And paleontologists use different sets of characteristics, different computer algorithms to build these family tree, these cladograms. Sometimes slightly different methods lead to slightly different arrangements. It's the scientific process in action.
But there were even more radical ideas about where it belonged, weren't there? Didn't Serino initially place it somewhere else entirely?
Yes. In the original 1994 paper, Serino suggested it was a basal spinosaurid, using the term Torvosauridea back then. He saw it related to the lineage leading to spinophores, but branching off before you get to Megalosauridae and Spinosauridae proper.
So outside both families, but related to them ancestrally.
That was his initial interpretation, yes. And then even more surprisingly, a 2003 study actually proposed it was closer to Allosaurus.
Allosaurus, that's a completely different major branch of theropods, the Allosaurids.
Exactly. That would have been a major shakeup. But that particular finding hasn't really held up. Most subsequent studies keep Afrovenator firmly within the Megalosauridae camp.
Okay, so the Allosaurus connection seems unlikely now. It mostly comes down to its exact spot within the Megalosaur family, or just outside it near the Spinosaurs.
Pretty much. And complicating things further, our understanding of the whole group Carnisauria, which traditionally included both megalosaurids and allosaurids, has also been evolving.
How so?
Well, finds of early allosaurids, like Afrovenator, have kind of blurred the lines and made people reevaluate the relationships at the base of these large theropod groups. For a while, some analyses suggested Megalosauridae might not even be a natural group, that it might be paraphyletic.
Meaning it didn't include all descendants of its common ancestor? Like some members were more closely related to other groups?
Right. But again, most recent studies tend to support Megalosauridae as a proper monophyletic group. It's just that the exact relationships within it, between Afrovenator, Dubroisaurus, Eustreptospondylis, and others, are still being fine-tuned.
It sounds like Afrovenator is a really important piece of the puzzle then,
Yeah.
especially being from Gondwana, from Africa.
Absolutely critical. It's probably the best understood megalosaur we have from Gondwana from that time period.
Yeah.
It gives us a vital data point for comparing how these big predator ecosystems were developing differently on the northern and southern continents back in the Jurassic.
So summing up this whole deep dive then, what are the really key things about Afrovenator you think people should remember?
Okay, key takeaways. 1, Afrovenator was a big meat-eating dinosaur, a theropod, living in what's now Niger during the Middle to Late Jurassic. Not Cretaceous, as first thought.
Right, the age is important.
2. Its discovery was huge because it gave us a really good look, a fairly complete skeleton of a major African predator from a time period where the record isn't always great.
A rare window into Jurassic Africa.
Exactly. 3. It had a unique combination of features, the gracile build, longish legs, the skull details like the horn, the S-shaped teeth, those specific vertebral and bone shapes we talked about.
Its unique fingerprint.
And 4. Its precise spot on the family tree is still debated, but it's definitely a key player in understanding the evolution of megalosauroids, that group related to Spinosaurs. It highlights how much we're still learning.
That constant refinement of the picture. Which leads nicely to a final thought, something for you, our listener, to chew on.
Given how much our view of Afrovenator its relationships has shifted just in the last few decades.
Yeah.
What other long-held ideas about dinosaur evolution might get completely upended by the next major fossil discovery, especially from places like Africa, which still holds so many secrets from this era?
Makes you wonder what else is out there, waiting in the rocks, doesn't it? A great thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.